The village of Borgo lay beneath a perpetual veil of mist, nestled in the shadow of the Carpathian Mountains, like a dying ember struggling against the encroaching darkness. For 300 years, the people had learned to live with their curse, to accept the tribute of blood and livestock that kept the master of Castle Dracula satisfied, to speak in hushed whispers when the full moon rose over the jagged peaks. They had learned to survive, but they had forgotten how to hope. Elara was different. From the moment she could walk, the other villagers noticed something peculiar about the blacksmith's daughter. Her eyes held a strange clarity, as if she could see beyond the veil of the mortal world into realms unknown. As a child, she would wake screaming from dreams of vast stone corridors and crimson tapestries, of a figure whose face she could never quite discern, surrounded by shadows that writhed like living things. Her mother would hold her through those long nights, stroking her dark hair and humming old hymns, never knowing that these were not nightmares but visions. The dreams intensified as Elara grew into womanhood. On her 20th birthday, she saw him clearly for the first time. Count Dracula stood in a chamber of black marble, his aristocratic features frozen in an expression of such profound anguish that it pierced her heart even through the barrier of sleep. His eyes, burning like coals in the darkness, seemed to look directly at her, and she heard a voice that resonated not in her ears, but in the very core of her being. "Help me." The words carried centuries of torment, of a soul trapped between damnation and oblivion, neither fully dead nor ever allowed to truly live. She woke with tears streaming down her face and a certainty that defied all reason. The monster that her people feared, the creature that had taken so many lives, was suffering. Somewhere beneath the predator lurked the remnants of a man, and that man was crying out for salvation. Father Mihail found her in the village chapel 3 days later, kneeling before the wooden crucifix that hung above the altar. The old priest had baptized her as an infant, had watched her grow with a mixture of affection and unease. He saw the determination in her posture now, and felt a cold dread settle in his bones. "You mean to go to the castle?" His voice echoed in the empty chapel, more statement than question. Elara rose and turned to face him. Her simple peasant dress could not diminish the strange authority that seemed to emanate from her slight frame. "I have been called, Father. I do not understand why, but I know with absolute certainty that I must go." The priest's weathered hands trembled as he gripped his prayer beads. "Child, you speak of walking into the very mouth of hell. Count Dracula is not a man to be pitied or saved. He is a demon in human form, a creature that has forsaken God and embraced eternal darkness. Whatever visions trouble your sleep, they are deceptions meant to lure you to your doom." Elara stepped closer, and Father Mihail was struck by the depth of compassion in her eyes. "What if they are not deceptions, Father? What if God himself has shown me a soul in torment, a prisoner of his own sins who longs for redemption? Can any soul be beyond the reach of divine mercy?" The priest had no answer. He had spent decades preaching forgiveness and grace, yet when confronted with the possibility that even a monster like Dracula might be saved, his faith wavered. He blessed her with shaking hands and pressed his own rosary into her palm, knowing that he would likely never see her alive again. The village gathered at dawn to watch Elara begin her journey. Her father, his face grey with grief, had forged her a small dagger of blessed silver, though they both knew it would be useless against what awaited her in the castle. Her mother simply held her, unable to speak through her tears. The other villagers maintained a respectful distance, crossing themselves and murmuring prayers for the dead, for they had already consigned her to that fate. The path to Castle Dracula wound through ancient forests, where the trees grew so thick that sunlight barely penetrated the canopy. Elara walked alone, her heart steady, despite the fear that whispered at the edges of her mind. She had packed little for the journey, only bread and water, the rosary from Father Mihail, and a small book of psalms that had belonged to her grandmother. She suspected that physical provisions would matter little where she was going. As she climbed higher into the mountains, the temperature dropped and the mist grew thicker, clinging to her skin like cold silk. The forest gradually gave way to bare stone and twisted vegetation that seemed to recoil from her touch. She passed the ruins of what had once been a monastery, its walls blackened by fire. Its holy symbols defaced by claws, that had left gouges in the ancient stone. This was the border between the world of the living and the realm of the undead, and she was crossing it with full knowledge of what lay ahead. Night fell swiftly in the mountains, and with it came the sounds that had haunted the nightmares of her people for generations. Wolves howled in the distance, their voices too deep and resonant to belong to natural animals. Wings flapped overhead, massive and leathery, stirring the mist into swirling patterns. Elara did not run. She continued walking, her lips moving in silent prayer, the rosary clutched in her left hand, while her right gripped the silver dagger. The wolves appeared first, emerging from the darkness like liquid shadow given form. They were enormous, their eyes glowing with an intelligence that was profoundly wrong. They circled her slowly, their growls vibrating through the ground beneath her feet. Elara stood perfectly still, meeting the gaze of what she recognized as the pack leader. She saw hunger there and cruelty, but also something else, a binding that went beyond natural instinct. These creatures were extensions of their master's will, and through them he was watching her. She spoke directly to the presence she felt observing through the wolves' eyes. "I have come as you called me. I do not come as prey or tribute. I come to free you from your chains, if you will allow it." For a long moment nothing moved. Then, as if released by an invisible command, the wolves parted, forming a corridor through their ranks. They did not retreat, but remained watchful as Elara walked between them, her head high, her faith her only armor. She could feel their hot breath on her ankles, could smell the musk of predators and something else underneath, the faint odor of decay and old blood. But they did not attack. The castle loomed ahead, revealed suddenly as the mist parted like a curtain. It perched on a cliff face that plunged into darkness, its towers reaching toward a sky where no stars shone. The architecture spoke of immense age and forgotten grandeur, of a time when this had been a fortress of men before it became a prison for the damned. Gargoyles leered from the battlements, their stone faces worn by centuries of rain, yet somehow still malevolent. The main gate stood open, a mouth of absolute blackness that promised nothing but suffering to those who entered. Elara crossed the threshold, and the temperature plummeted. Her breath came out in white clouds as she stepped into a vast entrance hall, lit by guttering torches that burned with a sickly green flame. The walls were hung with tapestries depicting scenes of battle and bloodshed, but the threads had faded to the color of dried blood. Suits of ancient armor stood in alcoves, empty, yet somehow watchful. Her footsteps echoed on marble floors that had once been white, but were now stained with patterns she tried not to examine too closely. A figure materialized from the shadows at the far end of the hall. He was tall and gaunt, dressed in the formal attire of a bygone era, his face corpse-pale and his movements possessing an unnatural fluidity. His eyes fixed on Elara with an expression of profound surprise, mixed with something that might have been concern. "Mistress, you should not be here." His voice carried the accent of old Transylvania, cultured but cold. "This is no place for the living, especially not for one so young and pure of heart. The master does not receive guests, and those who come uninvited rarely leave except as servants of the darkness." Elara met his gaze without flinching. "I was invited, though not in any way you might understand. I have come to speak with Count Dracula, and I will not leave until I have done so." The servant, for that was clearly what he was, studied her with ancient eyes. There was a sadness in his features, a weariness that spoke of centuries spent in service to a master he both feared and pitied. He had been human once, Elara realized, before being bound to this castle by oaths or curses that transcended death itself. "Very well." The servant bowed slightly, a gesture that retained vestiges of courtly grace. "I am Vasile, steward of this house. If you insist on this folly, I will announce you to the master. But know this, child, many have come seeking to destroy him armed with faith and blessed weapons. All have failed. The Count cannot be defeated by force, for his power is too great and his cunning too refined. If you hope to succeed where hunters and priests have failed, you must understand that you face not merely a monster, but a mind shaped by centuries of existence and twisted by sorrows you cannot begin to fathom. I do not come to destroy him." Elara's voice rang clear in the dead air of the castle. "I come to save him, If salvation is still possible for one who has dwelt so long in darkness. Vasily's expression shifted, revealing a flicker of something that might have been hope before it was quickly suppressed. Then you are either a saint or a fool, and I cannot determine which. Follow me. The master awaits in the great hall. He has known of your approach since you entered the forest. He has watched your progress through the eyes of his servants, and against all expectation, he has commanded that you be brought before him unharmed. They walked through corridors that seemed to stretch beyond the physical dimensions of the castle, past doors that led to chambers Elara sensed were better left unexplored. Portraits hung on the walls, depicting nobles in period dress, their eyes following her passage with predatory interest. Some of the faces were repeated across different centuries, aging and then young again, a testament to the unnatural longevity that the castle's master had shared with his most loyal followers. The great hall was a cathedral of darkness. Vaulted ceilings disappeared into shadows that torchlight could not penetrate. A massive fireplace dominated one wall, cold and empty. Its mantle carved with scenes from pagan mythology that predated Christianity. Long tables stretched across the floor, set with tarnished silver and crystal goblets that had not held wine in living memory. And at the far end, upon a throne of black oak, sat Count Dracula. He was both exactly as she had seen in her visions, and yet more terrible in reality. His face possessed a cruel beauty, aristocratic features that would have been handsome had they not been so utterly devoid of warmth. His eyes burned with an inner fire, reflecting centuries of accumulated rage and grief. He wore black velvet trimmed with ermine, the raiment of royalty now stained by time and blood. Power radiated from him like heat from a furnace, an oppressive weight that made the air itself difficult to breathe. When he spoke, his voice filled the chamber, resonant and commanding, carrying the authority of one who had ordered the deaths of thousands and felt no remorse. So, the dreamer has come at last. I have watched you, Elara. Daughter of the blacksmith, I have seen you grow from child to woman, witnessed your visions and your foolish determination. Tell me, what makes you believe that you can succeed where so many have failed? What delusion brings you into my domain, thinking to accomplish what warriors and saints could not? Elara walked forward until she stood at the base of the dais, her small frame dwarfed by the throne and its terrible occupant. She met his burning gaze without faltering, though every instinct screamed at her to flee. Because I do not come to fight you, my lord. I come because I have seen your suffering, and I believe that even one such as you might yet find redemption if the proper path can be found. Dracula leaned forward, his eyes narrowing, his lips curved in a smile that revealed the tips of elongated canines, sharp as razors. Redemption. You speak to me of redemption, child. I have lived for over 4 centuries. I have drunk the blood of innocents and reveled in their terror. I have watched empires rise and fall, have seen the world change while I remained forever unchanged, forever cursed. I am damned beyond all hope of salvation, bound by sins so vast that even God himself has turned his face from me. And yet you, a peasant girl with nothing but faith and naivety, believe you can save me. Elara felt the weight of his words, the crushing despair that underlay his mockery. But she also felt something else, a desperate hope that he dared not acknowledge even to himself. I believe that no soul is beyond redemption if they truly desire it. I have seen you in my dreams, my lord. I have seen the man you were before the curse took hold. And I have heard you call out for help, though you may not remember doing so. Your suffering is real, and it is that suffering, not your power or your cruelty, that has brought me here. The vampire lord rose from his throne in a single fluid motion, descending the steps of the dais with predatory grace. He circled Elara slowly, studying her as one might examine a curious artifact. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped to barely more than a whisper, yet it carried clearly in the vast chamber. You know nothing of suffering, child. You know nothing of watching everyone you love wither and die while you remain, unchanging and alone. You know nothing of the hunger that consumes from within, demanding blood, always blood, until the very thought of mercy becomes a distant memory. You speak of the man I was, but that man died centuries ago, and what remains is merely a monster wearing his face. He stopped directly in front of her, so close that she could feel the unnatural cold that emanated from his body. His hand reached out, pale fingers ghosting near her cheek without quite touching. I could kill you now. One moment of pressure, and your neck would snap. Or I could drain you slowly, savor every drop of your blood while you begged for death. Your faith would not save you. Your God would not intervene. And yet I find myself hesitating. Why? What is it about you that stays my hand? Elara reached up slowly and placed her warm hand over his cold one, pressing it gently against her cheek. Because somewhere deep within you, the man you were still lives, he is buried beneath centuries of pain and anger, chained by the curse that transformed you, but he endures. And he is weary, my lord, so very weary of the darkness and the blood and the endless hollow years. He wants to rest, but he does not know how. For just an instant, Dracula's carefully maintained mask slipped. Elara saw raw anguish flash across his features, a grief so profound that it seemed to age him despite his immortal nature. Then it was gone, replaced by cold fury. He pulled his hand away as if burned, retreating several steps. His voice, when it came, was harsh with suppressed emotion. "You dare too much, girl. You presume to understand things beyond your comprehension. Leave now, while I still permit it. Return to your village and forget this madness. There is no salvation here, only damnation and despair." But Elara did not move. "I cannot leave, my lord. Not until I have done what I came to do. I know that you are bound by a curse, a pact made in blood and sealed with death. I know that you did not choose this existence willingly, that it was forced upon you in a moment of agony and rage. And I know that the key to breaking that curse lies within these walls, hidden in the secrets you have kept for centuries." Dracula stared at her, and for the first time in hundreds of years, he felt something akin to fear. "How do you know these things? What power shows you visions of my past?" Elara touched the rosary at her throat. "I do not know if it is God or some other force that grants me these dreams. I only know that I have been shown glimpses of your story, fragments of the truth. I have seen a young nobleman who loved deeply and lost everything. I have seen betrayal and grief so terrible that it tore open a doorway to darkness. And I have seen that nobleman make a choice, a terrible bargain that seemed the only path to vengeance and survival, never understanding the true cost until it was too late." The vampire lord turned away, his shoulders rigid with tension. "You see too much." He walked to one of the tall windows that looked out over the mountains, his reflection absent from the ancient glass. "Yes, I made a bargain. When my beloved was murdered, when everything I held dear was destroyed by those I had trusted, I called out in my agony, and something answered. It offered me power, immortality, the means to take my revenge on those who had wronged me. I accepted, and in that moment of blood and dark ritual I became what I am now, a creature of the night, sustained by the life force of others, cursed to walk the earth until the end of time." "And your revenge?" Elara asked softly. "Did it bring you peace?" Dracula laughed, a sound utterly without humor. "Revenge brought me nothing but ash and regret. I destroyed my enemies, yes. I made them suffer as I had suffered. But when it was done, when the last of them lay dead at my feet, I found that the hole in my soul had only grown larger. The curse did not care about my grief or my justifications. It simply consumed, transforming me day by day into the monster you see before you. I tried to resist at first, tried to retain my humanity, but the hunger was relentless. And with each life I took, I felt my remaining humanity slip further away, until I could no longer remember why I had ever cared." Elara moved to stand beside him at the window. Together they looked out at the dark landscape, at the forests and mountains that had been his kingdom and his prison for so long. "The curse can be broken, my lord. I do not yet know how, but I will find the way. That is why I have come, and why I will remain until the task is complete." Dracula turned to look down at her, and in his ancient eyes she saw a war being waged between hope and despair, between the longing for release and the certainty that none was possible. "You will die here," he said quietly. "If not by my hand, then by the dangers that fill this castle. There are things in the dungeons below, remnants of failed experiments and ancient evils that I have bound but cannot destroy. There are spirits that haunt the towers, victims whose suffering was so great that they could not pass on even in death. This place is a nexus of darkness, and you, with your light and your faith, will draw that darkness to you like moths to a flame. Then I will face those dangers when they come." Elara's voice held no trace of doubt. "But I will not leave, and I will not abandon you to your curse. Where are the records of your transformation, the grimoires and documents that describe the ritual that bound you? They must still exist somewhere in this castle." The vampire lord studied her for a long moment, then made a decision that surprised even himself. "In the library. East wing, 3rd floor. But the texts are written in languages long dead, and the magic they describe is not meant for mortal minds. Many who have attempted to read those books have gone mad from the knowledge they contain. I will take that risk." Elara turned to leave, then paused. "One more question, my lord. Your beloved, the one whose death drove you to make your bargain. What was her name?" Dracula's expression became distant, lost in memories of a time so long ago that even he sometimes wondered if it had truly happened or if he had dreamed it all. Her name was Elisabetta. She was everything good in the world, and I failed to protect her. When she died, I felt my own soul die with her, and in that moment of absolute despair, I became what I am now. Elisabetta. Elara repeated the name softly, committing it to memory. "Thank you for trusting me with that, my lord. I will not fail her memory, or yours." She walked from the great hall, leaving Dracula alone with his thoughts. The vampire lord returned to his throne, but he did not sit. Instead, he stood in the shadows, wrestling with emotions he had thought long dead. Hope was a dangerous thing, more painful than any wound because it opened up the possibility of disappointment and loss. He had taught himself not to hope, to accept his damnation as inevitable and eternal. But this strange girl, with her impossible faith and her visions, had cracked that carefully constructed shell, and he could feel something stirring in the frozen wasteland of his heart. In the corridor outside, Vasile waited for Elara. He handed her a candlestick with a single flickering flame, its light seeming pathetically inadequate against the surrounding darkness. "The library is this way, mistress. I will guide you there, though I cannot remain with you once we arrive. There are wards on that place, old protections that even the master's servants cannot easily breach." As they walked through the castle's labyrinthine passages, Elara asked, "How long have you served him, Vasile?" The old servant's face grew even more melancholy. "I was the Count's steward in life, when he was still human and I a young man in his service. I witnessed his transformation, saw the darkness claim him. When he offered me the choice between death and eternal servitude, I chose servitude, thinking it the lesser evil. I have served him for 300 years now, neither living nor dead, bound to this castle by oaths that transcend mortality. I have watched him descend deeper into monstrosity with each passing decade, have seen the last remnants of the man I once knew buried beneath centuries of blood and cruelty, until tonight." "What changed tonight?" Elara asked. "You changed it, mistress. You are the first person in all these long years who has looked at the master and seen not a monster to be destroyed, but a soul to be saved. I had forgotten that such compassion was possible. We all had, and I think perhaps he had forgotten as well." They reached the library door, a massive portal of carved wood, bound with iron and covered in symbols that seemed to writhe in the candlelight. Vasile produced an ancient key and unlocked the door, pushing it open with effort. Dust billowed out, disturbed for the first time in decades. "Be careful, mistress. The knowledge within is dangerous, but you already know that. What you may not know is that the books themselves are partially aware, hungry for readers. They will try to seduce you with promises of power and forbidden understanding. Remember why you have come here, and do not let them lead you astray." Elara nodded and stepped into the library, the door closing behind her with a finality that echoed through the empty halls. She was alone now, surrounded by thousands of books that represented centuries of accumulated knowledge, much of it dark and terrible. The single candle she carried seemed a fragile defense against the waiting shadows, but she moved forward anyway, her faith, her shield, and her determination, her sword. The search had begun. The library was vast beyond comprehension, its shelves rising into darkness that the candlelight could not penetrate. Books lined every available surface, some bound in leather that still held the warmth of the animals from which it had been taken, others in materials that Elara could not identify and suspected she would rather not know. The air was thick with the smell of old parchment and something else underneath, a sweet corruption like flowers rotting in still water. Elara moved between the shelves, her candle casting dancing shadows that seemed to move with independent purpose. The books whispered to her, not with voices she could hear, but with sensations that pressed against her mind like fingers seeking entrance. They promised secrets, power beyond imagining, knowledge that would elevate her above ordinary mortals. She felt their hunger, their desperate desire to be read and understood after years of neglect. She prayed silently as she searched, the words of the Psalms forming a protective barrier around her thoughts. The whispers grew more insistent, more seductive, but she pushed them away and focused on her task. She was looking for something specific, a grimoire or journal that would detail the ritual of Dracula's transformation, the exact nature of the pact he had made, and the conditions that bound him to his cursed existence. Hours passed, though time seemed to move strangely in the library, stretching and compressing in ways that defied natural law. Elara found books on subjects she had never imagined existed. Treatises on necromancy, written in blood on human skin. Catalogues of demons with their true names and the rituals required to summon them. Accounts of plagues and catastrophes orchestrated by practitioners of the dark arts. Each volume she touched seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, eager to corrupt any who dared to read its contents. She was about to ascend a narrow staircase to the second level when she noticed a section of shelf that seemed different from the others. The books here were older, their bindings cracked and faded, and they were arranged with a care that suggested they held particular significance. Her hand was drawn to a volume bound in black leather, its cover embossed with a symbol she recognized from her visions, a dragon coiled around a cross in an eternal struggle between faith and darkness. The moment her fingers touched the book, the temperature in the library plummeted. Her breath became visible in the air, and the candle flame guttered and nearly went out. Elara pulled the volume from the shelf and carried it to a reading table, one of several that stood in a cleared space near the center of the room. She set down the candle and opened the book with trembling hands. The pages were covered in script that shifted and changed as she looked at it, Latin transforming into Romanian and then into languages even older, tongues that had not been spoken since before the time of Christ. But somehow, miraculously, she could understand the words. They burned themselves into her mind with terrible clarity, telling a story of love and betrayal, of a curse that went deeper than she had imagined. The journal belonged to Dracula himself, written in the years immediately following his transformation. The early entries were almost illegible, the handwriting wild and desperate, chronicling his horror at what he had become. He described the ritual in agonizing detail. It had taken place in a ruined chapel deep in the mountains, on a night when the barriers between worlds grew thin. He had called out to powers beyond mortal comprehension, offering his soul and his humanity in exchange for the power to avenge Elisabetta's death. What he had not understood, what the darkness had not revealed until it was too late, was the true nature of the curse. He would indeed gain immortality and terrible power, but he would be forever separated from the possibility of love or redemption. More than that, his transformation was bound to a specific condition. He had sealed the pact with Elisabetta's blood, a few drops preserved in a crystal vial that he had worn next to his heart. In his grief and rage, he had willingly used the essence of his beloved to fuel his metamorphosis, binding her memory to his damnation. The curse could only be broken by an act of equal power but opposite intent. Just as Dracula had used love to fuel hatred and life to create undeath, someone would have to reverse the process. It would require a sacrifice, not of blood or death, but of something far more precious. The curse could be lifted only if someone offered their own spiritual light freely and without reservation, channeling it through the same vial that had been used in the original ritual. But the cost would be terrible. The one who broke the curse would take upon themselves a portion of Dracula's accumulated darkness, bearing the weight of his sins until they could be absolved through suffering and penance. Elara read the passage 3 times, her heart growing heavier with each repetition. This was the answer she had sought, but it was not the answer she had hoped for. Breaking the curse would not simply free Dracula from his undead existence. It would transfer a measure of his damnation to whoever attempted the ritual, possibly condemning them to the same spiritual torment he had endured for centuries. And there was no guarantee that the ritual would even work, that her faith would be strong enough to counteract centuries of accumulated evil. She closed the journal and sat in silence, wrestling with the implications of what she had learned. She had come to the castle prepared to face physical danger, even death if necessary. But this was different. This was a threat to her immortal soul, a risk that her faith might not survive the corruption she would have to absorb. If she failed, she would become like the creatures that served Dracula, neither living nor dead, trapped in an existence of spiritual agony. A sound interrupted her thoughts, a soft footfall on the library floor. Elara looked up to find Dracula standing a few feet away, watching her with an expression she could not read. He had moved with such silence that she had not heard his approach, and she wondered how long he had been observing her. "You found it, then?" His voice was carefully neutral, revealing nothing of his thoughts. "The journal I wrote in the early years, when I still remembered what it meant to feel remorse." Elara stood, meeting his gaze. "I found the answer I was seeking, my lord. I know now what must be done to break your curse." Dracula moved closer, his eyes fixed on the journal that lay open on the table. "Do you also know the cost? Do you understand what such an attempt would demand of you?" "I understand." Elara's voice was steady, despite the fear that churned in her stomach. "The one who breaks the curse must take upon themselves a portion of your darkness. They must bear the weight of your sins until those sins can be redeemed through suffering." The vampire lord reached out and closed the journal with a sharp snap. "Then you also understand why I cannot allow you to attempt this madness. I am damned, Elara. I have accepted my fate. I will not permit you to sacrifice yourself in a futile attempt to save a monster who is beyond salvation. That is not your decision to make." Elara picked up the journal, holding it close to her chest. "You called out for help whether you remember doing so or not. Your soul, the part of you that still remembers love and goodness, reached across the barrier between worlds and found me. I did not come here by accident or foolish idealism. I came because I was called. And I will not turn away from that calling simply because the path is more difficult than I expected." Dracula turned away, his hands clenched into fists. "You speak of things you do not comprehend. The darkness I carry is not some abstract concept or spiritual metaphor. It is real, tangible, a living corruption that has grown and festered for 3 centuries. If you attempt to take even a portion of that into yourself, it will devour you from within. You will experience every death I have caused, feel the terror of every victim whose blood I have drunk. You will know the weight of damnation, and it will crush you. Perhaps—" Elara moved to stand before him, forcing him to look at her. "Or perhaps my faith is stronger than you believe, and the light I carry can survive even in the deepest darkness. I do not claim to be a saint or a martyr. I am simply a woman who has been given a task, and I will see it through to the end, whatever that end may be." The vampire lord stared down at her, and for the first time in centuries he felt something other than hunger or rage. He felt genuine concern for another being, a desire to protect her from harm even if it meant remaining cursed forever. The sensation was so unexpected, so foreign after his long existence of solitary suffering, that it shook him to his core. Why? The question emerged as barely more than a whisper. "Why would you risk everything for me? You owe me nothing. You do not even know me, not truly. I am a murderer, a creature that has brought nothing but suffering and death to your people. What possible reason could you have for caring whether I am saved or damned?" Elara reached up and placed her hand over his heart, feeling the faint, irregular beat that should not exist in one who was technically dead. "Because every soul has value, my lord. Because the man you were before the curse still exists somewhere within you, and he deserves a chance at redemption. And because I have seen your suffering in my dreams, and I cannot turn away from another being in pain, no matter what they have done." Dracula covered her hand with his own, his cold fingers a stark contrast to her warmth. "You will not succeed. Even if you survive the ritual itself, even if you manage to break the curse, what remains will not be the man you imagine. 300 years of monstrosity cannot be erased by a single act of redemption. I am too far gone, too deeply stained by my crimes. Then let that be your choice to make after the curse is broken." Elara's voice was gentle but firm. "Let you decide, as a free man with a soul restored, what atonement you owe for your actions. But first we must free you from the chains that bind you to this existence. The rest can come later." The vampire lord released her hand and stepped back, his expression hardening into the cold mask he had worn for so long. "Very well. If you are determined to pursue this course, I will not stop you. But neither will I help you. The vial you seek, the crystal that contains Elisabetta's blood, is hidden in a place that even I rarely visit. It lies in the deepest chamber of the castle's crypt, guarded by things that will not hesitate to destroy you. If you wish to find it, you will have to face those guardians alone." "Where can I find this chamber?" Elara asked, already knowing that she would go there regardless of the danger. Dracula moved to one of the library windows, looking out at the night. "Beneath the castle lie catacombs that predate even my family's occupation of this fortress. They were carved by people whose names are forgotten, used for purposes that I have only partially discerned from the symbols they left behind. The chamber you seek is at the very heart of those catacombs, in a place where the boundary between the living world and the realm of the dead grows thin. Vasile can show you the entrance, but he cannot accompany you into the depths. No living servant can survive in that place for long, and even I find it uncomfortable to linger there." "I will go at first light," Elara said, though she wondered if dawn ever truly came to this castle of eternal night. Dracula turned back to her, and she saw something in his eyes that might have been admiration. "You are either the bravest person I've ever met, or the most foolish. Perhaps both. But I will tell you this, Elara, daughter of the blacksmith. If you die in those catacombs, if the guardians tear you apart or the darkness claims your soul, I will mourn you. That is something I have not done for anyone in 300 years, and I find that I am not certain how I feel about it." He vanished then, simply dissolving into shadow and mist, leaving Elara alone in the library with the journal and her thoughts. She sat back down at the table and reread the relevant passages, committing every detail to memory. The ritual itself was complex but not impossible. She would need the vial of Elisabetta's blood, her own faith as a channel for divine grace, and the willingness to accept the consequences of her actions. The timing was also crucial. The ritual had to be performed at the moment between night and dawn, when darkness gave way to light, symbolizing the transformation she hoped to achieve. Elara remained in the library until she heard Vasile's footsteps approaching. The old servant appeared in the doorway, carrying a tray with simple food and water. "You must eat, mistress. You will need your strength for what lies ahead." She accepted the food gratefully, realizing that she had not eaten since leaving the village. The bread was stale and the water had a metallic taste, but it sustained her body even as her mind continued to grapple with the task before her. Vasile waited patiently, his ancient face lined with concern. "You spoke with the master," he said when she had finished eating. "He told me that you know what must be done, and that you intend to proceed despite the danger. I beg you to reconsider, mistress. The catacombs are not meant for the living. Things dwell there that have long since forgotten mercy or reason. Even if you survive the guardians, the weight of what you propose to take upon yourself may be more than any mortal can bear." "I have considered everything, Vasile." Elara's voice was calm, touched with a serenity that came from acceptance of her path. "I know the risks, and I choose to proceed anyway. All I ask is that you show me the entrance to the catacombs. The rest I will do alone." The servant studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Very well, mistress. I will show you the way at dawn. Until then, you should rest. There is a chamber that has been prepared for you, one of the few rooms in the castle that still remembers warmth and light. Follow me." He led her through the corridors to a room in the south tower, one that seemed less oppressive than the rest of the castle. A fire burned in the hearth, real flames rather than the sickly green witch fire that illuminated most of the fortress. A simple bed stood against one wall, made up with clean linens that looked absurdly normal in this place of darkness. A window looked out over the mountains, and though night still reigned, Elara could see the faintest hint of grey on the eastern horizon. "Rest now, mistress." Vasile bowed and moved to leave, then paused at the door. For what it is worth, I believe you may succeed where others have failed. You possess something that those who came before lacked. You do not seek to destroy the master, but to save him, and that difference may be enough to tip the balance. I pray that it is so, for his sake and for yours." When he was gone, Elara knelt beside the bed and prayed, not for success or safety, but for the strength to do what needed to be done regardless of the cost. She prayed for Dracula, for the tormented soul trapped within the monster's body. She prayed for Elisabetta, whose love had been twisted into a tool of damnation, and she prayed for guidance that she might find the wisdom to navigate the trials ahead. She must have dozed eventually, for she was awakened by Vasile's gentle touch on her shoulder. Dawn approached, though the light that filtered through the window was grey and reluctant, as if even the sun feared to fully illuminate this cursed place. The servant handed her a lantern and a bundle containing rope, a small knife, and a flask of holy water that he had somehow procured. "The entrance to the catacombs is in the chapel beneath the main hall," he explained as they descended through the castle. "It has been sealed for many years, but the master has ordered that it be opened for you. I must warn you one final time, mistress. Once you descend into those depths, you will be beyond any help we can offer. The guardians that dwell below answer to no one, not even to Count Dracula himself. They are remnants of an older darkness, bound to the catacombs by wards and rituals that predate his transformation." They reached a small chapel that had clearly once been consecrated to Christian worship, but had long since been desecrated. The altar was overturned, the cross above it inverted and stained with substances Elara chose not to examine closely. Behind the altar, a heavy stone slab had been pulled aside, revealing a stairway that descended into absolute darkness. Dracula stood beside the entrance, waiting. He had changed his formal attire for simpler clothing, dark and practical, as if he had been preparing for physical labor. When he saw Elara, his expression remained carefully blank, but she sensed the turmoil beneath that cold exterior. "I will accompany you as far as I can," he said without preamble. "The first levels of the catacombs are safe enough, and I can ensure that you reach the descent to the deeper chambers without incident. Beyond that, you will be on your own." Elara wanted to protest that he need not put himself at risk, but she understood the real reason for his offer. He needed to see this through, to witness her courage or her failure, to know once and for all if redemption was truly possible or if he was indeed beyond all hope. So she simply nodded and followed him down the stairs. The descent seemed endless, spiraling down into the earth far below the foundations of the castle. The walls were carved with symbols that predated any language Elara knew, spirals and geometric patterns that seemed to shift when viewed from the corner of her eye. The air grew colder and heavier with each step, thick with the smell of earth and decay and something else, an odor like incense mixed with blood. They passed through chambers filled with bones, the remains of countless dead stacked in alcoves and arranged in patterns that suggested ritual purpose. Some of the skulls bore marks of violence, others showed signs of disease, and a few had been altered in ways that spoke of arcane experimentation. Dracula moved through these spaces without comment, his face revealing nothing, though Elara sensed that he found these halls oppressive even with his supernatural nature. They reached a junction where 3 passages diverged into the darkness. Dracula stopped and pointed to the central path. "That way leads to the deep chamber. Follow the passage until you reach a door marked with the symbol of the dragon and the cross. Beyond that door lies what you seek, but also the guardians I warned you about." "What are these guardians?" Elara asked, though she was not certain she wanted to know the answer. The vampire lord's expression grew distant, as if recalling memories he would rather forget. "When my ancestor first built this fortress, he made pacts with powers that dwelled in these mountains long before humans arrived. He bargained for protection and strength, offering in return certain privileges and territories. The guardians are the result of those pacts, creatures that exist in the space between life and death, bound to protect what lies in the deep chamber. They will not listen to reason or pleas for mercy. They will attack anything living that enters their domain, and they are nearly impossible to destroy by conventional means." "How do I get past them?" Elara gripped her lantern tighter, trying to steady her nerves. Dracula reached into his coat and produced a small object wrapped in black cloth. He unwrapped it carefully, revealing a medallion of tarnished silver bearing the crest of his family. This medallion was worn by the original lord who made the pacts. It may offer you some protection, though I cannot guarantee it. The Guardians have grown wild over the centuries, less bound to the old agreements, but it is the only aid I can offer you. Elara took the medallion and hung it around her neck, feeling its weight settle against her chest. Thank you, my lord, for everything. Dracula looked at her for a long moment, his ancient eyes searching her face as if trying to memorize every detail. If you succeed in what you attempt, if you truly manage to break the curse and survive the process, I want you to know that your sacrifice will not be forgotten. I have lived for centuries without purpose or meaning, simply existing from one day to the next. But you have shown me that there is still something in this world worth believing in, even if that something is only the foolish courage of one mortal woman. Before Elara could respond, he turned and walked back the way they had come, his footsteps echoing in the stone corridors until they faded into silence. She was alone now, truly alone, facing the final stage of her quest with nothing but her faith and the small bundle of supplies that Vasile had provided. She took a deep breath, whispered a prayer for courage, and stepped into the central passage. The walls here were rougher, less obviously shaped by human hands, as if this section of the catacombs had been discovered rather than built. The symbols carved into the stone grew more primitive and disturbing, depicting scenes of sacrifice and transformation that made her stomach clench with unease. The passage opened into a natural cavern, vast and echoing, with stalactites hanging from a ceiling lost in darkness. At the far end, barely visible in the light of her lantern, stood a door of ancient wood bound with iron. The symbol of the dragon and cross was carved deep into its surface, just as Dracula had described. But between Elara and that door, moving in the shadows at the edges of her light, were the Guardians. They were difficult to look at directly, their forms seeming to shift and blur, as if they existed only partially in the physical world. They had bodies that suggested wolves or great cats, but their proportions were wrong, their limbs too long and jointed in places that defied natural anatomy. Their eyes glowed with a pale phosphorescence, dozens of eyes where there should have been only two, and their mouths were filled with teeth like broken glass. Elara clutched the medallion at her throat and stepped forward, her voice steady as she spoke a prayer aloud. The Guardians circled closer, their movements fluid yet unsettling, like creatures swimming through water rather than walking on stone. One of them lunged toward her, jaws gaping, but stopped short when the medallion flared with a faint silver light. The creature recoiled, making a sound somewhere between a growl and a wail. The medallion was working, but Elara could sense that its protection was limited. The Guardians had not forgotten their ancient oaths entirely, but they were testing the boundaries, probing for weakness. She continued walking, slowly and steadily, never taking her eyes off the creatures that stalked her from the shadows. Sweat ran down her back despite the cold, and her heart hammered so hard she feared it might burst. She was halfway across the cavern when one of the Guardians broke from the pack and charged directly at her. The medallion blazed brighter, but the creature came on anyway, mad with hunger or duty or some combination of both. Elara had no time to think, only to react. She grabbed the flask of holy water from her bundle and hurled its contents at the charging Guardian. The effect was immediate and terrible. Where the holy water touched the creature's form, it began to dissolve, unraveling like smoke in a strong wind. The Guardian shrieked, a sound that scraped across Elara's nerves like knives on stone, and thrashed in agony before finally dissipating entirely. The other Guardians drew back, their glowing eyes fixed on her with what might have been fear or rage or ancient hatred. Elara did not wait to find out which. She ran the remaining distance to the door, her breath coming in ragged gasps, the Guardians howling and snapping at her heels. She reached the door and grabbed the iron handle, pulling with all her strength. For a terrible moment the door would not budge, and she felt claws rake across her back, tearing through her dress and drawing blood. Then the door gave way with a groan of ancient hinges, and she tumbled through, slamming it shut behind her just as the Guardians reached it. They threw themselves against the door with enough force to shake the walls, but the barrier held. After several minutes the assault ceased, and Elara heard them retreat back into the cavern, their task of protecting the threshold complete. She leaned against the door, her whole body shaking with reaction, blood seeping from the wounds on her back. The pain was sharp but manageable, and she thanked God that the claws had not gone deeper. When her breathing steadied, she raised her lantern and looked around the chamber she had entered. It was smaller than the cavern outside, circular and domed, with walls covered in ancient frescoes depicting scenes from a religion long forgotten. At the center of the chamber stood a stone pedestal, and upon that pedestal rested a crystal vial no larger than her thumb. Even from a distance, she could see the dark liquid within, Elisabetta's blood, preserved by dark magic across the centuries. Elara approached the pedestal slowly, reverently, aware that she stood in a place saturated with old power and older grief. The vial seemed to pulse with its own dim light, and she could feel the weight of the curse that radiated from it like heat from a forge. This small object contained the key to both Dracula's damnation and his potential salvation. She reached out and took the vial in her hand. The moment her fingers closed around it, a vision slammed into her mind with the force of a physical blow. She saw a young woman with dark hair and gentle eyes, laughing as she danced in a garden filled with roses. She saw that same woman older and sadder, standing in a castle window and looking out at a world at war. And she saw her final moments, betrayed and murdered by those she had trusted, her blood spilling onto cold stone while she called out a name with her dying breath. Dracula. The vision shifted, and she saw the man himself, younger and more human than the creature she knew, cradling Elisabetta's body and screaming his grief and rage at an uncaring sky. She felt the moment he made his terrible choice, felt the darkness rush in to fill the void where his soul had been, transforming him from man to monster in an instant of agony and power. The vision released her, and Elara found herself on her knees, tears streaming down her face. She understood now, truly understood, the depth of Dracula's loss and the weight of his crimes. She also understood that Elisabetta would not have wanted this, that the woman whose blood filled the vial would have begged her beloved not to sacrifice his humanity for vengeance. The curse had been built on a foundation of love twisted into hatred, and only by restoring that love could it be broken. Elara placed the vial carefully into her bundle and stood, using the wall for support. She had what she needed, but the journey back would be no less dangerous than the descent. The guardians still waited outside, and she no longer had the holy water to defend herself. She would have to trust in the medallion and her faith to see her through. But first, she needed to bind her wounds and gather her strength for the trials ahead. Elara tore strips from the hem of her dress and bound her wounds as best she could, wincing at the sting, but grateful that the injuries were not deeper. The guardian's claws had raked across her shoulder blades, leaving 3 parallel gashes that bled freely, but had not struck anything vital. She offered a prayer of thanks and steeled herself for the return journey through the catacombs. The door opened more easily from the inside, as if the chamber itself was eager to release her now that she had claimed its treasure. The cavern beyond was silent, but Elara could sense the guardians waiting in the shadows, patient and implacable. She held the medallion forward like a shield and stepped out into the darkness. The creatures emerged immediately, circling her with that same fluid, unnatural movement. But this time they kept their distance, maintaining a perimeter just beyond the reach of the medallion's protective influence. They followed her across the cavern, a silent escort that made no move to attack but never allowed her to forget their presence. When she reached the passage that led back toward the upper levels, they stopped at the threshold and watched her go, their phosphorescent eyes gleaming in the darkness like malevolent stars. The climb back up through the catacombs seemed longer than the descent, each step an effort as exhaustion and blood loss took their toll. Elara's vision swam occasionally, and she had to stop and rest against the wall, forcing herself to breathe deeply and maintain consciousness. The vial in her bundle seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment, as if the curse it contained had physical weight that pressed down upon her shoulders. She was halfway up when she encountered something unexpected. A figure stood in the passage ahead, blocking her path. For a moment her heart lurched with fear, thinking it might be some new horror rising from the depths. Then the figure moved into the light of her lantern, and she recognized Vasile. The old servant's face was creased with concern as he took in her battered appearance, the blood soaking through the makeshift bandages, the way she leaned against the wall for support. "Mistress, you are injured. Let me help you." He moved to support her, placing one arm carefully around her waist to avoid her wounds. Together they made their way up the remaining stairs, Vasile's steady presence a comfort after the terrors of the deep chamber. He did not ask about what she had found or what she had endured, simply focused on getting her back to safety. They emerged into the desecrated chapel to find Dracula waiting, pacing like a caged predator. When he saw Elara's condition, something flickered across his face, an expression too quick to identify, but too strong to be entirely hidden. He crossed the space between them in an instant, his cold hands reaching out to steady her before he seemed to remember himself, and withdrew. "You are hurt." His voice was tight with an emotion he would not name. "The Guardians attacked you." "I survived." Elara's voice was weak but steady, and I found what I sought. She pulled the vial from her bundle and held it up so he could see. Even in the dim light of the chapel, the crystal caught and reflected what little illumination there was, and the blood within seemed to glow with its own dark radiance. Dracula stared at it, his expression transforming into something raw and unguarded. Pain, longing, and ancient grief warred across his features. "Elisabetta." He whispered the name like a prayer and a curse combined. After all these centuries, to see even this small remnant of her. He reached out as if to take the vial, then stopped himself, his hand falling back to his side. "No. If I touch it now, the curse will recognize its own essence and may resist the breaking. You must keep it safe until the ritual." Vasile interrupted gently. "Mistress needs medical attention and rest. The ritual cannot be performed if she is too weak to channel the necessary power." Dracula seemed to shake himself from his reverie. He nodded curtly and gestured toward the stairs. "Take her to the chamber in the south tower. Tend to her wounds and see that she has food and drink. I will prepare the great hall for the ritual. It must be done at dawn, when darkness gives way to light." The vampire lord paused at the chapel entrance and looked back at Elara. His ancient eyes held a strange mixture of hope and dread, as if he could not decide whether he wished for her success or her failure. "What you propose to do, what you have already endured to reach this point, no one has ever shown me such courage or such foolish compassion. I find that I am both grateful and terrified in equal measure." Then he was gone, dissolving into shadow and mist, leaving Elara alone with Vasile. The old servant helped her back through the corridors to the south tower, supporting her weight when her legs threatened to give out. By the time they reached her chamber, she was barely conscious, the combined effects of exhaustion, blood loss, and the psychic weight of the visions she had experienced taking their toll. Vasile laid her gently on the bed and set about tending to her wounds with practiced efficiency. He had clearly done this before, perhaps many times over his long years of service. He cleaned the gashes with water that had been blessed by a priest in some distant past, then applied a salve that smelled of herbs and something else, something that made the pain recede to a manageable level. He bound the wounds with clean linen and stepped back to examine his work. "You must rest now, mistress. The ritual will require all your strength, both physical and spiritual. I will bring you food and drink, and you must consume what you can. The ordeal ahead will tax you beyond anything you have yet experienced." Elara wanted to argue that there was no time for rest, that she needed to prepare for the ritual immediately. But her body had reached its limits. She fell into a deep sleep the moment her head touched the pillow. Her dreams filled with images of Elisabetta and the young man Dracula had been before darkness claimed him. She woke to find night still reigning beyond her window, though something in the quality of the darkness suggested that dawn was approaching. Vasile sat in a chair beside her bed, keeping watch like a faithful guardian. When he saw her eyes open, he immediately rose and brought her a tray laden with simple but nourishing food. "You slept for several hours, mistress. It is nearly time. The master has been preparing the great hall. He has cleared away centuries of accumulated darkness, reopened windows that have been sealed since his transformation, and arranged everything according to the specifications in his journal. He works with a feverish intensity, as if afraid that if he stops moving he will lose his nerve entirely. Elara sat up slowly, testing her body's responses. The wounds on her back still ached, but the pain was manageable, and she could move without difficulty. She ate what Vasile had brought, forcing herself to consume every bite, even though her stomach churned with nervous anticipation. She drank deeply from the cup of water he offered, then stood and straightened her torn and blood-stained dress as best she could. "I am ready." The words came out stronger than she felt, but she refused to show weakness now at the crucial moment. "Take me to the great hall." Vasile led her through corridors that seemed different somehow, as if the castle itself sensed the approaching transformation and was holding its breath in anticipation. They passed windows that had been thrown open for the first time in centuries, allowing fresh air to circulate through the stale atmosphere. The sickly green flames that had illuminated the halls had been replaced by honest torches, their warm light a stark contrast to the unnatural glow that had preceded them. The great hall had been transformed. The long tables had been pushed aside, creating an open space at the center of the chamber. The massive fireplace, cold and empty for so long, now blazed with real fire that cast dancing shadows across the walls. The windows stood open, and through them, Elara could see the first faint lightening of the eastern sky, the promise of dawn still distant, but drawing inexorably closer. Dracula stood at the center of the cleared space, dressed in simple clothing devoid of ornament or ceremony. He had removed his aristocratic trappings, and without them, he looked simultaneously more human and more vulnerable. When Elara entered, he turned to face her, and she saw that he had been preparing himself as thoroughly as he had prepared the hall. His expression was calm, almost serene, the mask of the predator set aside to reveal the man underneath. "Are you certain you wish to do this?" He asked the question without preamble, his voice stripped of its usual commanding tone. "Once we begin, there can be no turning back. You will take into yourself a portion of my darkness, will bear witness to crimes that would break most minds. You may not survive the process, and if you do, you may find yourself forever changed, marked by the evil you absorb. I give you one final chance to reconsider, to leave this place and return to your life unburdened by my curse." Elara crossed the hall to stand before him, the vial clutched in her hand. "I am certain, my lord. I did not come this far to turn back at the threshold of success. Whatever the cost, whatever the consequences, I will see this through." Dracula studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Then let us begin. The ritual must be completed before the sun fully rises, while we stand in the liminal space between darkness and light. I will guide you through the necessary steps, but you must be the one to speak the words and channel the power. My voice alone cannot break a curse I willingly embraced." He gestured to a spot on the floor where he had drawn a circle in what looked like salt mixed with crushed herbs. In the center of the circle stood a small altar, nothing more than a block of stone that he must have carried up from the chapel below. Upon the altar lay an open book, the journal Elara had found in the library, turned to the page that described the breaking of the curse. "Stand within the circle." Dracula's voice had taken on the tone of a teacher, instructing a student, careful and precise. "Place the vial upon the altar and position yourself so that you face the eastern window. When the first rays of sunlight touch the horizon, you will begin the incantation. The words are written in the journal, a prayer of absolution and transformation. As you speak them, you must open the vial and anoint my forehead with Elisabetta's blood while holding the intent to reverse the original curse." "And then?" Elara asked, though she already knew the answer from her reading. "And then you will feel the darkness begin to flow from me into you." Dracula's expression was grave. "It will not be a gentle process. You will experience every death I have caused, every moment of suffering I have inflicted, as if you yourself had committed those acts. The weight of 3 centuries of damnation will press upon your soul. You must hold firm to your faith, anchor yourself to the light you carry within. If you falter, if you allow the darkness to overwhelm you, you will be lost and the curse will simply transfer to you while I am destroyed utterly." "I understand." Elara stepped into the circle and took her position as instructed, the vial held carefully in both hands. "And what of you, my lord? What will happen to you during this process? I will experience the restoration of my humanity, or what remains of it after centuries of corruption. Dracula moved to stand outside the circle, close enough that she would be able to reach him, but not so close as to interfere with the working. I will feel my soul, long trapped in spiritual death, struggle to return to life. It will be agony beyond description, for a soul that has been damned does not return easily to grace. But if the ritual succeeds, if your faith proves strong enough, I will be freed from the curse that has bound me. I will be mortal once more, subject to aging and death, but also capable of redemption and perhaps of peace. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a vulnerability that Elara had not heard before. I want you to know, regardless of what happens, that you have already given me something I thought forever lost. You have shown me that compassion still exists in this world, that there are those who would risk everything to save even a monster like me. For that gift alone I am more grateful than words can express. Elara felt tears prick at her eyes, but blinked them away. There would be time for emotion later, if they both survived. Now she needed to focus all her attention on the task at hand. She opened the journal and read through the incantations silently, committing the words to memory. They were written in Latin, but she found that she could understand them perfectly, as if the language had been inscribed directly into her mind. Vasily appeared at the edge of the circle, his ancient face solemn. I will keep watch, mistress. If anything should go wrong, if dark forces attempt to interfere with the ritual, I will do what I can to protect you both. Dracula nodded his thanks to his old servant, then turned his full attention to Elara. The sky beyond the windows was growing lighter, the stars fading one by one as dawn approached. They stood in silence, waiting for the precise moment when the ritual must begin, the tension in the air almost palpable. Elara used the time to center herself, to draw deep into the wellspring of faith that had sustained her throughout this journey. She thought of her village, of the simple chapel where she had knelt in prayer so many times. She thought of Father Mihail and his blessing, of her parents and their tearful farewell. She thought of all the people who had lived and died under the shadow of Castle Dracula, victims of a curse they had never understood and could not fight. This was for them as much as for the vampire lord himself, a chance to break the cycle of fear and death that had poisoned the land for 3 centuries. The first ray of sunlight touched the eastern horizon, a thin line of gold against the dark mountains. Elara felt it like a physical sensation, a warmth that penetrated even the cold stone of the castle. This was the moment. She began to speak, her voice clear and strong, the Latin words flowing from her lips with a power that seemed to come from beyond herself. As she recited the incantation, she uncapped the vial with trembling fingers. The blood within had not coagulated, despite the centuries, preserved by the same dark magic that had fueled the original curse. It gleamed wetly in the growing light, dark as wine and heavy with accumulated sorrow. Elara dipped her finger into the blood, feeling it cold against her skin, then reached out to Dracula. The vampire lord closed his eyes and bowed his head, offering himself to her touch with a trust that bordered on the absolute. Elara traced the sign of the cross on his forehead with Elisabetta's blood, completing the incantation as she did so. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the vial in her hand suddenly blazed with light, pure and white, and the blood on Dracula's forehead began to glow with the same radiance. The transformation began. Dracula gasped and staggered, his body convulsing as if struck by lightning. His eyes flew open, and Elara saw that they were no longer the burning red of the vampire, but a clear grey, human and vulnerable. He fell to his knees, his hands pressed against his chest, as if he could feel his long, dormant heart struggling to beat with life, rather than the slow, irregular pulse of the undead. At the same moment, Elara felt something dark and terrible rush toward her like a wave of ice water. The darkness Dracula had carried for 3 centuries poured out of him and into her, fulfilling the terms of the ritual. She tried to brace herself, tried to maintain her grip on her faith, but nothing could have prepared her for the onslaught. She saw through Dracula's eyes as he drained his first victim, a young woman who had trusted him, who had come to him seeking help. She felt his savage joy as the blood flowed into his mouth, the intoxicating rush of power and the terrible guilt that followed. She experienced his second kill, and his third, and his 100th. An endless parade of faces twisted in terror and pain. She saw villages burned, children orphaned, lovers torn apart by his hunger and his rage. But she also felt his suffering, the constant gnawing emptiness that no amount of blood could fill, the loneliness of existing forever outside the bounds of humanity. She felt his desperate attempts to hold on to some shred of his former self, attempts that grew weaker with each passing year, until finally he had simply accepted what he had become and stopped fighting. The visions came faster now, a torrent of memory and emotion that threatened to drown her. She felt herself slipping, her grip on her own identity loosening as Dracula's darkness pressed in from all sides. She could not breathe, could not think, could only experience an endless litany of horror and despair. Then, from somewhere deep within her, a light began to shine. It was small at first, barely a spark in the overwhelming darkness, but it grew steadily stronger. She felt her faith rise up like a shield, the absolute certainty that she was loved by something greater than herself, that the darkness could not ultimately triumph over the light. The prayers she had learned as a child came flooding back, and she spoke them aloud, her voice gaining strength with each word. The darkness recoiled from that light, but it did not disappear. Elara understood now what the ritual truly required. She could not simply banish the evil that had stained Dracula's soul. She had to absorb it, take it into herself and bear its weight, trusting that her faith would be strong enough to eventually transform it. This was the sacrifice the curse demanded, not her death, but her willingness to carry a burden of sin that was not her own. She opened herself fully to the darkness, accepting it even as it burned like acid through her spirit. She felt it settle into her soul, a heavy presence that would remain with her for as long as it took to work through and redeem. The weight was immense, crushing, threatening to drive her to her knees. But she remained standing, anchored by her faith, and by the knowledge that this suffering had purpose and meaning. The light from the vial began to fade, and with it the worst of the visions receded. Elara found herself back in her own body, gasping for breath, tears streaming down her face. She looked down at Dracula and saw that he had collapsed completely, lying on the cold stone floor, his chest rising and falling with genuine breath, his skin losing the corpse pallor of the undead and taking on the flush of living warmth. Vasile rushed forward, kneeling beside his master and feeling for a pulse. When he found it strong and steady, his weathered face broke into an expression of wonder. It worked. "Mistress, you have done it. The curse is broken." Elara wanted to respond, but she found that she could not speak. The effort of the ritual, combined with the wounds she had sustained in the catacombs and the immense weight of darkness she had just absorbed, had pushed her beyond her limits. The hall spun around her, and she felt herself falling, the world dissolving into merciful unconsciousness. The last thing she heard before darkness claimed her was Dracula's voice, weak but undeniably human, speaking her name with a reverence usually reserved for saints and angels. "Elara, my savior, what have you done? What terrible price have you paid for my redemption?" Then there was nothing but darkness, though this time it was the simple darkness of exhaustion rather than the spiritual darkness she had battled. And in that darkness, she dreamed of dawn breaking over the mountains, of light pouring into places that had known only shadow for far too long, and of a man with grey eyes who wept tears of gratitude and grief in equal measure. Elara woke to find herself in the chamber in the south tower, sunlight streaming through the window in golden shafts that seemed almost aggressive after so much time spent in darkness. Her body ached as if she had been beaten, every muscle protesting as she tried to sit up. But it was the weight in her soul that truly troubled her, a constant pressure that made even breathing feel like an effort. She could feel them now, the sins she had absorbed from Dracula, not as visions but as a constant presence in the back of her mind. Every life he had taken whispered to her, demanding acknowledgement, seeking justice or mercy, or simply recognition that they had existed and suffered. The weight was almost unbearable, and she understood now why the ritual had warned that few could survive such a burden. The door opened, and Vasile entered carrying a tray with food and water. His expression was complex, gratitude mixed with concern and something that might have been pity. "Mistress, you have been unconscious for 2 days. We were beginning to fear that you might never wake. 2 days. Elara's voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. What has happened? Did the ritual succeed completely? Is he truly freed? Vasile set the tray on a table beside the bed and helped her sit up, propping pillows behind her back. The ritual succeeded beyond our greatest hopes. The master is mortal again, fully human with all the vulnerability that entails. He has been keeping vigil outside your chamber, refusing to leave even to rest or eat properly. He blames himself for the state you are in, for the burden you now carry because of him. I made my choice freely. Elara accepted the cup of water Vasile offered, drinking deeply to soothe her parched throat. Where is he now? The old servant gestured toward the window. He went to watch the sunrise. It is the first time in over 3 centuries that he has been able to look upon the sun without pain or fear. He stood there for nearly an hour this morning, weeping like a child, before I finally convinced him to step back inside, lest he burn his newly mortal skin. Elara felt a surge of emotion, joy mixed with the ever-present weight of darkness she now carried. At least her sacrifice had not been in vain. Dracula was free, restored to humanity, given a chance at the redemption he had sought for so long. I need to see him. Help me stand. Vasile looked doubtful but did not argue. He supported her as she rose from the bed, steadying her when her legs threatened to give way. She was weaker than she had realized, the ritual having drained not just her spiritual reserves, but her physical strength as well. Together, they made their way out onto the balcony that adjoined her chamber. Dracula stood at the edge of the balcony, his face turned toward the sun, with an expression of such profound wonder that it transformed his features entirely. Gone was the cold mask of the predator, the calculating cruelty that had defined his existence for centuries. In its place was something raw and vulnerable, a man rediscovering sensations he had thought lost forever. He turned when he heard them approach, and Elara saw tears tracking down his cheeks, catching the morning light like diamonds. His eyes, now a clear grey flecked with green, widened when he saw her. Elara, you should not be out of bed. You need to rest, to recover your strength. I needed to see you. She stepped away from Vasile's support, swaying slightly but managing to stand on her own. I needed to see that the ritual truly worked, that you are free. Dracula crossed the balcony in 3 quick strides and took her hands in his, and for the first time, Elara felt genuine warmth in his touch. His hands were no longer the cold appendages of the undead, but living flesh, warm with circulating blood and trembling with emotion. Free. The word came out choked with feeling. Yes, I am free. But at what cost? Elara, what you have done, what you have taken upon yourself for my sake, the weight you now carry. He broke off, unable to continue, his newly mortal emotions overwhelming him. Elara squeezed his hands gently, trying to offer comfort even as she struggled with her own burden. I knew the price when I agreed to pay it. I do not regret my choice, my lord. Do not call me that. His voice was almost pleading. I am no longer a lord of darkness, no longer a creature to be feared and revered. I am simply a man, mortal and fallible, with a debt I can never hope to repay. Please, call me by the name I was given at birth, the name I have not heard spoken with kindness in over 300 years. Call me Vlad. Vlad. Elara tested the name, feeling how it transformed him in her perception, making him less of a legend and more of a person. It suits you better than the title you wore for so long. They stood together in the sunlight, and for a moment, the weight Elara carried seemed slightly lighter, as if sharing the space with someone who understood what she had sacrificed made the burden more bearable. But then a wave of darkness surged up from within her, and she gasped, doubling over as visions of blood and death flooded her mind. She saw a young man, barely more than a boy, begging for his life as Dracula, as Vlad, drained him slowly, savoring his terror. The vision passed, but it left Elara shaking and sick to her stomach. Vlad caught her before she could fall, lifting her easily despite his newly mortal state and carrying her back to the bed. His face was ashen, guilt and horror warring for dominance in his expression. This is what you bear now, all my crimes, all my victims, living eternally within your soul. God in heaven, what have I allowed to happen to you? Vasile placed a cool cloth on Elara's forehead as she lay trembling on the bed. The darkness you absorbed is not simply memory, mistress. It is spiritual corruption, the accumulated weight of sins that were never repented, never forgiven. It will continue to torment you until those sins can be absolved through suffering and penance. The process could take years, possibly decades, and there is no guarantee that you will survive it intact. Then I will help her. Vlad's voice was fierce with determination. I will not stand by and watch her suffer for my crimes while I enjoy the freedom she bought me with such a terrible price. There must be something I can do, some way to ease her burden. There is. Father Mihail's voice came from the doorway, startling them all. The old priest stood at the threshold, leaning heavily on a walking stick, his weathered face grave, but not unkind. The village received word 2 days ago that the terror had ended, that the curse on Castle Dracula had finally been broken. I came as quickly as my old legs would carry me, knowing that if the miracle had truly occurred, both the redeemed and the Redeemer would need spiritual guidance. Vlad stared at the priest, his expression cycling through surprise, shame, and desperate hope. Father, I am the last person who deserves your help or your blessing. The crimes I have committed against your faith and your people are beyond counting. Father Mihail entered the chamber, his eyes taking in the scene with a wisdom born of decades, serving as shepherd to his flock. That is precisely why you need my help, my son. Redemption is not given to those who deserve it, but to those who seek it with sincere hearts. And as for you, child, he turned his attention to Elara. You have taken upon yourself a burden that was never meant to be carried alone. The sins you absorbed must be worked through, but there are ways to lighten the load, to make the journey toward absolution more bearable. The old priest moved to sit in the chair beside Elara's bed, his movements slow but steady. The process is called spiritual transference and reconciliation. It requires both the one who committed the sins and the one who now carries them to work together, acknowledging each wrong, seeking forgiveness from those who were harmed or their descendants, and performing acts of penance and restoration. It will not be easy or quick, but it offers a path forward that does not require Elara to bear the entire weight alone. Vlad knelt beside the bed, taking Elara's hand in both of his. I will do whatever is necessary. I will spend the rest of my mortal life, however long or short it may be, working to atone for what I have done. If that means traveling to every village I terrorized, facing the families of every victim I claimed, then so be it. I will not hide from my past any longer. Father Mihail nodded approvingly. That is a good beginning. But you must understand, the road ahead will test you both beyond anything you have yet endured. The people you wronged will not forgive easily. Many will want revenge rather than reconciliation, and Elara will continue to suffer under the weight of your darkness until enough penance has been done to begin the process of absolution. I am ready to face whatever comes. Elara's voice was weak but determined. I did not come this far to fail now. If there is a path forward, no matter how difficult, I will walk it. The priest reached into his robe and produced a rosary, old and worn, the beads polished smooth by countless prayers. This belonged to my predecessor, who served this parish before the curse began. He was a man of great faith and greater compassion, and I believe he would want you to have it now. Pray with this when the darkness becomes too heavy to bear. The accumulated prayers of the faithful have power, and they may provide some relief in your darkest moments. Elara accepted the rosary with trembling fingers, feeling the weight of history and faith it carried. Thank you, Father, for coming, for believing in us both despite everything. The old priest stood, preparing to leave. I will return in 3 days with a list of the villages and families most affected by the curse. We will begin the work of reconciliation then, starting with those closest to here and working outward. In the meantime, Elara must rest and regain her strength. And you, he turned to Vlad, must prepare yourself for what is to come. The people will not see you as I see you, a repentant soul seeking redemption. They will see only the monster who tormented them for generations. You will need courage and humility in equal measure. After Father Mihail departed, Vasily excused himself to attend to household matters, leaving Vlad and Elara alone. The former vampire lord pulled a chair close to the bed and sat, his mortal body showing signs of the exhaustion he had not allowed himself to acknowledge. Now that the immediate crisis had passed, he looked vulnerable in a way that would have been unthinkable mere days ago. "I find myself in unfamiliar territory." His voice was quiet, almost wondering. For 3 centuries I felt nothing but hunger and rage, and the cold satisfaction of power exercised. Now I feel everything. Joy at the warmth of sunlight, sorrow for the lives I destroyed, gratitude for your sacrifice, fear that I will fail you, that all your suffering will have been for nothing. It is overwhelming. That is what it means to be human. Elara managed a small smile despite the pain that throbbed through her body and soul, to feel everything, the good and the terrible, and to choose each day how to respond to those feelings. You have been given a second chance, Vlad. Not many receive such a gift bought with your agony. He looked down at their joined hands, his expression tortured. How am I supposed to live with that knowledge? How can I accept this freedom knowing what it cost you, by making it mean something? Elara's grip tightened on his hand. By using your second chance to heal the wounds you inflicted, to bring hope where you once brought only despair. Your redemption and my healing are bound together now. If you waste the life I helped restore to you, then my sacrifice truly will have been in vain. Vlad nodded slowly, accepting the weight of responsibility she placed upon him. Then I will make you a promise, Elara. I will spend every day of my remaining mortal life working to atone for my crimes. I will face every victim's family, endure every curse and condemnation they heap upon me, and I will never stop trying to earn the redemption you have already given me. And I will stay by your side, helping you bear the burden you carry until the last of my darkness has been transformed into light. They remained that way for a long while, hands clasped, drawing strength from each other as the sun climbed higher in the sky. Outside the window, the world continued as it always had, but something fundamental had shifted. The shadow that had lain over the Carpathian Mountains for 3 centuries had finally begun to lift. Over the following days, Elara slowly regained her physical strength, though the spiritual weight she carried remained constant and sometimes overwhelming. The visions came at random times, triggered by seemingly innocuous things. The sight of blood when Vasile accidentally cut his finger while preparing food sent her spiraling into a memory of a massacre in a village square. The howl of a wolf in the distant mountains brought back the night Vlad had hunted a family through the forest, playing with them like a cat with mice. Each time the darkness threatened to consume her, Vlad was there, anchoring her to the present, reminding her of who she was and why she had chosen this path. He would hold her through the worst of the visions, his presence a comfort, even though he knew he was the source of her suffering. And gradually, as the days passed, Elara learned to manage the burden better, to create mental barriers that kept the worst of the darkness at bay. Father Mihail returned as promised, bringing with him a detailed accounting of Vlad's crimes. The list was extensive, covering 300 years of terror and death, villages destroyed, families torn apart, individuals murdered for sport or sustenance or simple cruelty. Reading through it, Vlad's newly mortal heart broke a little more with each entry, but he did not look away or make excuses. He accepted the full accounting of his sins, committing every name to memory. "We will begin with the village of Borgo," Father Mihail announced. "It is closest to the castle and suffered greatly under the curse. Many of the current inhabitants are descendants of those you wronged. They deserve to be first to hear your confession and decide whether they can find it in their hearts to forgive." Vlad stood, squaring his shoulders despite the fear she could see in his eyes. "I am ready. Let us begin the work of reconciliation." But Elara struggled to rise from her chair, a wave of darkness crashing over her so powerfully that she cried out. Vlad rushed to her side, supporting her as she fought to remain conscious. The vision that gripped her was different from the others, more intense and more personal. She saw Elisabetta in her final moments, not just her death, but the profound betrayal she had felt, the crushing realization that the man she loved had been willing to sacrifice everything, including his own humanity, rather than accept her loss and continue living. When the vision released her, Elara found herself weeping for a woman who had died centuries before she was born. Vlad held her, his own tears mingling with hers, mourning together for the love that had been lost, and the terrible price its loss had demanded. She did not want this. Elara's voice was raw with emotion. Elisabetta did not want you to become what you became. She would have begged you to go on living, to honor her memory by remaining human and eventually finding happiness again. But you chose vengeance instead, chose power and immortality, and in doing so, you dishonored everything she believed in. Vlad's body shook with the force of his grief. I know. God help me, I know. That is perhaps the worst of my crimes, that I transformed her love into an instrument of darkness, that I used her blood to fuel my transformation into a monster. How can she ever forgive me? How can I ever forgive myself? Father Mihail spoke gently but firmly. That is what we will work toward, my son. Forgiveness both from others and from yourself. It will not happen quickly, and it may never be complete. But the journey itself has value, the act of facing what you have done and striving to make amends. That is the essence of redemption. The priest helped Elara back to her chair, then placed a hand on Vlad's shoulder. Tomorrow we begin the visits to the villages. Tonight you both should rest and pray, ask for strength to face what is coming, and for the grace to accept whatever response you receive. Some will curse you, some may even try to harm you. You must face it all with humility and courage. That night Elara knelt in prayer for hours, the rosary Father Mihail had given her clasped in her hands. She prayed for Vlad, that he would have the strength to endure what awaited him. She prayed for herself, that she could continue to bear the burden she had accepted. And she prayed for all those who had suffered under the curse, that they might find peace and healing in its ending. Vlad found her there, still kneeling as the hours stretched toward midnight. He knelt beside her, awkward and uncertain, for he had not prayed in centuries and was no longer sure he remembered how. But he tried, speaking from his heart rather than from memory, asking forgiveness for crimes too numerous to name individually, pledging himself to the work of atonement, no matter how long it took or how much it cost. As they prayed together, something shifted in the atmosphere of the chamber. The weight that pressed upon Elara seemed fractionally lighter, as if their combined intention had created a small space of grace within the overwhelming darkness. It was not much, barely noticeable, but it was enough to give them both hope that the path they had chosen might actually lead somewhere other than despair. When dawn broke the next morning, they prepared to descend from the castle for the first time together, to begin the long and difficult work of reconciliation. Vasile stood at the castle gates, his ancient eyes bright with emotion as he watched his master prepare to leave. "I will maintain the castle in your absence," he said formally, though his voice shook slightly. "When you are ready to return, it will be waiting. But, Master, I must tell you that I am proud of you, proud of the courage you show in facing your past, proud of the man you are becoming. The young nobleman I once served would be pleased to see what you are attempting now." Vlad embraced his old servant, something he had never done in all the centuries of Vasile's service. "Thank you, my friend, for staying loyal through the darkest times, for believing that redemption was possible even when I had long since given up hope. When I return, if I return, I pray it will be as someone worthy of that loyalty." Elara, Vlad, and Father Mihail began their descent from the castle as the sun climbed higher in the sky. Behind them, Castle Dracula stood silent on its cliff, no longer a place of terror, but not yet a place of peace. It would take time, perhaps years, before the stain of centuries could be cleansed. But the work had begun, and that was something. The path to the village of Borgo wound through forests that seemed different now, less threatening without the oppressive presence of the curse hanging over them. Birds sang in the trees, and small animals moved through the underbrush without fear. Nature itself seemed to sense that something fundamental had changed, that the long nightmare was finally ending. As they approached the village, Elara felt the darkness within her stir and grow heavier. This place held memories of suffering, of attacks that had decimated the population and left scars that had never healed. Vlad felt it too. She could see it in the way his steps slowed, and his breathing became labored. He was about to face the living descendants of people he had murdered, and no amount of redemption could erase the terror he had inflicted. The villagers had been warned of their coming, and a crowd had gathered in the square. Their faces ranged from curiosity to anger, to deep, abiding hatred. Some held crosses and weapons, clearly prepared to defend themselves if necessary. Others simply stared, trying to reconcile the tales of the immortal vampire lord with the mortal man who stood before them now. Father Mihail stepped forward, raising his hands for silence. "People of Borgo, hear me. The curse that has plagued our lands for 3 centuries has been broken. The man you knew as Count Dracula stands before you now as Vlad, returned to mortality, and seeking to atone for his crimes. He has come to confess his sins against your families and to submit himself to whatever justice you deem appropriate." A murmur ran through the crowd, a mixture of disbelief and anger. Then an old woman stepped forward, her face deeply lined, her eyes burning with decades of grief and rage. "You killed my grandfather. You murdered my mother when I was but a child. You destroyed everything my family built over generations. And now you come seeking forgiveness? What gives you the right to ask for mercy when you showed none to those you slaughtered?" Vlad met her gaze steadily, though Elara could see him trembling. "I have no right. Grandmother, I come not to ask for forgiveness, for I know that many of my crimes are unforgivable. I come only to acknowledge what I have done, to bear witness to the suffering I caused, and to offer what little recompense I can. If you wish my death, I will not resist. If you wish me to suffer as your family suffered, I will endure it. I am at your mercy, as your grandfather and mother were once at mine, and I will not compound my crimes by defending myself against justice long overdue." The old woman stared at him, her weathered hands clenched into fists. Then, slowly, she began to weep, great racking sobs that seemed to come from the depths of her soul. It was not just grief for her lost family, but the release of decades of fear and hatred. The overwhelming relief that the monster who had haunted her nightmares was finally truly gone. Others in the crowd began to weep as well, their tears a mixture of sorrow for what had been lost and hope that they might finally begin to heal. Not all were so moved. Some still glared with undimmed hatred, and Elara knew that the road ahead would be long and painful. But it was a beginning, the first step on a journey that would ultimately lead to something resembling peace if they could find the strength to continue. As the sun reached its zenith, Vlad began to speak, recounting in painful detail the crimes he had committed against the village of Borgo. Each name he spoke was like a knife to his newly restored heart, and by the time he finished, he was on his knees in the dirt, his face streaked with tears. And through it all, Elara stood beside him, bearing the weight of his darkness even as he bore the weight of his shame, 2 souls bound together in the difficult work of redemption. 3 years passed like a procession of seasons, each marked by journeys to villages and towns throughout Transylvania and beyond. Vlad and Elara traveled together, never apart for more than a day, their lives bound by the curse they had broken and the burden they shared. They visited every place Vlad had terrorized, stood before every family he had wronged, confessed every crime he could remember, and many he had tried to forget. The responses varied as widely as human nature itself. Some villages welcomed them with cautious hope, ready to believe that redemption was possible, and eager to move beyond the shadow of fear that had defined their existence. Others met them with violence, and more than once, Vlad bore the marks of stones thrown or fists swung in righteous anger. He accepted every blow without complaint, never raising a hand to defend himself, for he believed that any suffering he endured was less than what he deserved. Elara's burden grew lighter with each act of penance, each moment of genuine remorse that Vlad demonstrated. The visions still came, but they were less frequent now, less overwhelming. The darkness she carried was slowly being transmuted through the alchemical process of suffering, acknowledged and amends attempted. It would never disappear entirely, Father Mihail had warned her, for some stains go too deep to ever be fully removed. But it could be reduced to something manageable, a weight she could carry without being crushed beneath it. They had established a pattern to their work. Father Mihail would travel ahead to the next village, preparing the people for their arrival and identifying those most directly affected by Vlad's crimes. Then Vlad and Elara would come, and he would stand in whatever public space the village designated and speak the truth of what he had done. He never made excuses or tried to justify his actions. He simply acknowledged the harm he had caused and offered whatever restitution was in his power to give. In some places, that restitution took the form of physical labor. Vlad helped rebuild homes that had been destroyed in his attacks, worked fields that had lain fallow because the farmers who tended them had been killed, restored churches that had been desecrated by his presence. His mortal body, no longer possessing supernatural strength, ached with exhaustion at the end of each day, but he welcomed the pain as a form of penance. In other places, the restitution was financial. The castle held treasures accumulated over centuries, and Vlad distributed them freely to those who had suffered loss. Gold and jewels that had once been symbols of his power became tools of healing, funding orphanages and hospitals, supporting widows and providing dowries for young women whose marriage prospects had been destroyed by the curse. But the most important restitution was simply presence, the willingness to stand before those he had wronged and bear witness to their pain. Many needed nothing more than to be heard, to have someone acknowledge that their suffering had been real and unjust. Vlad gave them that, listening to story after story of fear and loss, absorbing their anger and grief without deflecting or defending himself. Through it all, Elara remained at his side, a constant presence that both supported and challenged him. When his resolve wavered, when the weight of his guilt threatened to crush him into despair, she reminded him that despair was a form of self-indulgence, that true penance required him to keep going, no matter how difficult the path became. And when he was tempted to fall back into old patterns of thought, to see himself as irredeemably monstrous, she showed him evidence of the good he was doing, the healing that was slowly spreading through the communities he had once terrorized. Their relationship had evolved in ways neither had anticipated. What had begun as savior and saved had deepened into something more complex and more profound. They knew each other in ways that went beyond normal human intimacy, for Elara carried Vlad's darkness within her and understood his capacity for both evil and remorse with a clarity that was almost painful. And Vlad had witnessed Elara's strength and compassion in circumstances that would have broken most people, had seen her maintain her faith even when burdened with sins that were not her own. Love had grown between them, though neither spoke of it directly. It was not the passionate, consuming love that Vlad had shared with Elisabetta, the kind of love that could drive a man to damnation when it was lost. This was something quieter and more durable, built on shared suffering and mutual respect, on the knowledge that they were stronger together than apart. It was a love that had been earned through years of difficult work, rather than granted in a moment of romantic intensity. On the 3rd anniversary of the curse's breaking, they found themselves in a small village high in the mountains, one of the last places on Father Mihail's list. The village had suffered terribly in the final decades of Vlad's reign as vampire lord, losing nearly half its population to his attacks. The survivors had built a memorial in the village square, a simple stone monument inscribed with the names of the dead. Vlad stood before that monument for hours, reading each name aloud, speaking into the mountain air the identities of those he had destroyed. His voice broke repeatedly, but he forced himself to continue until every name had been acknowledged. Then he knelt in the dirt before the memorial and bowed his head, waiting for the villagers to pass whatever judgment they deemed appropriate. The village elder, a man whose own father had died in Vlad's attacks, stepped forward. He was younger than many of the other elders they had met, barely 40, but his eyes held the weariness of someone who had seen too much suffering too early in life. "We have watched your progress over these 3 years. Word travels through the mountains, and we have heard of your work in other villages, of the restitution you have offered and the penance you have performed. We have also heard of the woman who walks beside you, who broke your curse at terrible cost to herself." He turned to look at Elara, his expression softening slightly. "You did not have to sacrifice yourself for one such as him. No one would have blamed you for leaving him to his damnation. Yet you chose compassion over judgment, and in doing so you have begun a process of healing that extends far beyond the breaking of a single curse. For that, you have our gratitude and our respect." The elder returned his attention to Vlad. "As for you, I will not pretend that I can forgive what you did to my father or to the others whose names are carved on this stone. That forgiveness is not mine to give. But I can acknowledge that you are no longer the creature who committed those crimes, that you have worked diligently to atone for your sins." And I can choose to move forward rather than remaining trapped in the past. We do not welcome you, but neither do we condemn you. That is the best I can offer. It is more than I deserve." Vlad's voice was thick with emotion. "Thank you for your grace and your willingness to look beyond what I was to what I am trying to become." The elder nodded and stepped back, and the gathered villagers slowly dispersed, returning to their homes and their lives. The confrontation they had feared, the violence or rejection they had braced themselves for, had not materialized. Instead, there was simply acknowledgement and the tentative possibility of moving forward. That night, Elara and Vlad stayed in a small inn at the edge of the village. They sat together by the fire, watching the flames dance and listening to the wind whistle through the mountain passes. The darkness Elara carried was quieter now than it had been in months, as if even the weight of Vlad's sins recognized that progress was being made toward redemption. "We have visited almost every place on Father Mihail's list," Elara spoke softly, her hand resting in Vlad's. "Soon this journey will come to an end. Have you thought about what comes after?" Vlad was silent for a long moment, staring into the fire. "I have thought of little else. For 3 years I have had a clear purpose, a defined task to complete. But when it is done, when we have visited the last village and made the last amends that are possible to make, what then? I am mortal now, subject to aging and death. I have perhaps 30 or 40 years remaining if I am fortunate. How should I spend that time?" Elara turned to look at him, seeing the lines that had begun to appear at the corners of his eyes, the silver starting to thread through his dark hair. He was aging now, moving through the years at a normal human pace after centuries of unchanging immortality. The process clearly unsettled him, this visible reminder of his mortality and the finite nature of his remaining time. "How do you want to spend it?" Vlad met her gaze, and in his grey-green eyes she saw vulnerability and hope in equal measure. "I want to spend it with you if you will have me. I know I have no right to ask for your companionship beyond what our shared burden demands. You have already given me far more than I deserve, but these 3 years have shown me that my life has meaning when it is dedicated to something beyond my own desires. And the thought of facing the remaining years alone, without your presence to guide and steady me, fills me with a fear I have not felt since I was mortal the first time." Elara felt tears prick at her eyes, moved by the sincerity in his voice and the courage it must have taken to make himself so vulnerable. "I want that too. These years have been difficult, but they have also been meaningful in ways I never imagined. Together, we have done something that matters, have brought healing to places that had known only suffering. I would like to continue that work, in whatever form it takes, with you beside me. Then let us make a new vow." Vlad took both her hands in his touch warm and steady. Not a vow born of desperation or darkness, but one made freely in the light of day. "I vow to spend my remaining years working to build rather than destroy, to bring hope rather than fear, to honor the gift of redemption you have given me by living in a way that would make you proud. And I vow to stand beside you, supporting you as you continue to bear the burden we share, until the day when that burden is finally light enough that you can set it down entirely." Elara smiled through her tears. "And I vow to remain your companion and your conscience, to remind you of your humanity when you doubt it, and to celebrate your victories over your darker nature. I vow to help you become the man you were meant to be before tragedy and poor choices led you astray. And I vow to love you, not as Elisabetta loved you, with passion that could lead to damnation, but with a steady affection that will endure whatever trials still await us." They sealed their vows with a kiss, gentle and unhurried, a promise rather than a proclamation, and in that moment, the darkness that Elara had carried for 3 years seemed to lift just a little more, as if the act of choosing love over fear had pushed back against the weight of ancient sins. The next morning brought a surprise visitor. Vasile arrived at the inn, having travelled from the castle with news that could not wait. His ancient face was alight with an emotion Elara had rarely seen in him, something very close to joy. "Master, mistress, you must return to the castle immediately. Something miraculous has occurred." They made the journey back to Castle Dracula with all possible speed, arriving as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks. The castle looked different, Elara noticed immediately. Windows that had been shuttered for centuries stood open to the air. Tapestries that had been dark with age and blood had been taken down, and the walls showed signs of fresh whitewashing. The oppressive atmosphere that had once made every breath difficult had dissipated, replaced by something that felt almost like peace. Vasile led them to the great hall, where Father Mihail waited with several other priests from neighboring parishes. They stood in a circle around something on the floor, and as Elara drew closer, she saw that it was the spot where the ritual had been performed 3 years ago. The salt circle was still faintly visible, and the stone altar still stood at the center. But something new had appeared. Growing from a crack in the stone floor, impossibly, was a rose bush. It bore a single white bloom, perfect and unblemished, its petals seeming to glow with their own soft light. The rose exuded a fragrance that filled the entire hall, sweet and clean, driving out the last lingering traces of corruption and decay. Father Mihail turned to them, his old eyes bright with tears. 3 days ago this rose appeared, pushing up through solid stone, as if the castle itself had decided to bring forth life. I have consulted with my brothers in the faith, and we are in agreement about what this signifies. It is a sign of grace, a physical manifestation of the spiritual transformation that has taken place within these walls. The curse is not merely broken, but reversed. The evil that once dwelt here replaced by something pure and good. Vlad approached the rose slowly, almost fearfully, as if he expected it to wither at his touch, but when he knelt beside it, the bloom seemed to open further, turning its face toward him like a flower seeking the sun. He reached out with trembling fingers and touched one perfect petal, and Elara saw his expression transform into something she had never seen before, absolute wonder, unmarred by any shadow of guilt or shame. Elisabetta. He whispered the name with reverence. This is her forgiveness, her blessing on what we have accomplished. She was always fond of white roses. She grew them in the garden of our first home before the war came and destroyed everything. I thought I would never see their like again, but here, in this place of death and darkness, life has found a way to return. Father Mihail placed a hand on Vlad's shoulder. Your beloved has given you the absolution you could not give yourself. She has shown you that redemption is real, that the man you were is not lost forever but can be reclaimed through genuine repentance and hard work. This rose is her gift to you and through you, to all who have suffered under the curse. Elara knelt beside Vlad, and as she did, she felt something shift within her. The darkness she had carried for 3 years, the terrible weight of Vlad's accumulated sins, suddenly loosened its grip on her soul. It did not disappear entirely, for such burdens cannot simply vanish, but it transformed, becoming something she could finally begin to release. The visions that had plagued her grew distant and faint, fading like dreams upon waking, their power to torment her finally broken. She looked at Vlad, and he looked back at her, and in that shared glance, they both understood what had happened. The penance was not complete, for the work of redemption is never truly finished while one lives. But they had done enough, suffered enough, atoned enough that grace could finally begin its work of true healing. The rest would come in time, through continued effort and faith, but the worst was over. The priests began to sing, their voices joining in a hymn of thanksgiving and praise. The sound filled the great hall, and Elara imagined she could hear other voices joining in. The spirits of those who had died in this place finally finding the peace that had been denied them for so long. The castle was being reconsecrated, transformed from a monument to darkness into something that might, in time, become a beacon of hope. Over the following weeks, more roses appeared throughout the castle, pushing up through stone floors and emerging from cracks in ancient walls. Some were white like the first, others red or pink or yellow, creating gardens in the most unlikely places. The villagers began to speak of it as a miracle, and pilgrims started arriving to see the transformation for themselves. Many came seeking healing for their own wounds, spiritual or physical, and Father Mihail established a ministry within the castle to serve them. Vlad and Elara remained at the castle, but their roles had changed. They were no longer supplicants seeking forgiveness, but servants offering aid to others who struggled with their own darkness. They shared their story freely, holding back nothing, allowing their journey from curse to redemption to serve as encouragement for those who believed their own sins too great to be forgiven. The work was not always easy. There were still those who could not forgive, who carried their hatred and grief like weapons they refused to put down. Vlad faced such people with patience and understanding, never demanding their forgiveness, but always offering his sincere regret for the harm he had caused. And slowly, very slowly, even the hardest hearts began to soften. 5 years after the curse was broken, on a crisp autumn morning when the mountains blazed with color, Vlad and Elara were married in the small chapel beneath the castle. Father Mihail performed the ceremony, his voice strong despite his advancing years. The chapel had been thoroughly cleansed and reconsecrated, the inverted cross removed and replaced with a new one carved from white oak. Candles burned in every alcove, their light driving back the shadows that had once held dominion there. The ceremony was small and intimate, attended only by Vasile, a handful of villagers who had become friends over the years, and several priests who had assisted in the work of reconciliation. But Elara felt the presence of others, unseen witnesses who had gathered to celebrate this union. She imagined Elisabetta among them, no longer a source of sorrow but a gentle presence offering her blessing on the love that had grown from such difficult soil. When Father Mihail pronounced them husband and wife, Vlad kissed Elara with a tenderness that belied his former nature. This man who had once been a monster of legend, who had taken countless lives without remorse, was now capable of such gentleness that it brought tears to the eyes of all who witnessed it. And Elara, who had sacrificed so much to save him, finally received the reward for her faith, a partner who understood the depths of her strength and cherished her for it. They established their home in the south tower of the castle, in the same chambers where Elara had first rested after entering this place of darkness. But the rooms were bright now, filled with sunlight and the fragrance of roses that grew in planters on the balcony. From their window, they could see the mountains stretching into the distance, beautiful and no longer threatening, restored to the majesty that had drawn Vlad's ancestors to build their fortress here centuries ago. Years passed, marked by the changing seasons and the gradual transformation of the region. Villages that had lived in fear for generations learned to trust again, to build futures rather than merely surviving day to day. The castle became a center of learning and healing. Its library opened to scholars who came to study the ancient texts it contained, its halls used for gatherings that celebrated life rather than mourning death. Vlad aged as all mortals do, his hair turning silver, his face gaining lines that spoke of experience and hard-won wisdom. But he aged with grace, accepting his mortality as a gift rather than a curse. He had been given 40 years after the breaking of the curse, 40 years to atone for the 300 he had spent as a monster, and he used every day of that time purposefully. Elara aged beside him, her own dark hair streaked with grey, her features softening with the passage of time. The weight she had carried for so long had transformed completely now, the darkness fully transmuted through years of love and service. She could barely remember what it had felt like to bear that crushing burden, though she never forgot the lessons it had taught her about compassion and the true cost of redemption. On a spring morning 30 years after their wedding, as white roses bloomed throughout the castle and the mountains rang with birdsong, Vlad woke to find breathing difficult. He had known this day was coming, had felt his mortal body growing weaker over the past months. He was an old man now, having lived into his 70s, a lifespan he would never have achieved without Elara's intervention. And he was ready, unafraid of the death that awaited him, for he had spent decades preparing for this final journey. Elara sat beside his bed, holding his hand as she had held it through so many trials. Her own eyes were bright with tears, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "Do not be afraid. You have paid your debts and earned your rest. Whatever waits beyond this life, you will face it as a man redeemed, not as a monster condemned." Vlad smiled, the expression transforming his aged features with a joy that had nothing to do with his physical condition. "I am not afraid. How could I be when I have been given such grace? I was damned beyond all hope, lost to darkness for centuries, yet I was saved by the courage and compassion of one remarkable woman. I have been allowed to spend decades making amends, to see the fruits of repentance and experience the profound gift of genuine love. I am the most fortunate of men, and I go to my rest with gratitude rather than fear." He paused, gathering his strength to speak the words that mattered most. "Thank you, Elara. Thank you for seeing something worth saving when everyone else saw only a monster. Thank you for bearing my darkness when it would have been easier to let me remain cursed. Thank you for loving me when I had given you every reason to hate me instead. You gave me back my humanity, and with it, you gave me the chance to become someone worthy of the life I had been given. That is a gift beyond price, and I will carry it with me into whatever comes next." Elara leaned down and kissed his forehead, her tears falling like rain on his aged face. "And thank you for using that gift so well, for becoming the man I believed you could be, for working so hard to atone for your past and build a better future, for loving me with patience and devotion through all our years together. You have shown me that redemption is real, that no one is beyond the reach of grace if they are willing to do the difficult work of transformation. Rest now, my love. Your work is done, and it was done well." Vlad's breathing grew shallow, and Father Mihail, who had been summoned hours before, stepped forward to administer the last rites. The old priest, ancient now himself and nearing his own end, spoke the words with a strength born of absolute conviction. He had witnessed the entire journey, from the breaking of the curse to this final peaceful ending, and he knew without doubt that he was commending to God's care a soul that had been truly redeemed. As the morning sun filled the chamber with golden light, Vlad took his final breath. His last word was a name, spoken with such love and wonder that all who heard it felt their hearts swell with emotion. Elisabetta. Then he was gone, his mortal body finally releasing the soul that had been imprisoned for so long. Elara held him for a long time, weeping for the loss of her companion and the end of their shared journey. But even through her grief, she felt a profound sense of peace. Vlad had died as he had lived in his final years, surrounded by love, at peace with God and himself, his sins forgiven, and his soul restored. It was the ending they had both worked toward, and though it brought sorrow, it also brought a sense of completion. They buried him in the garden that had grown up around the castle, in soil that now nurtured life rather than corruption. The white rosebush from the great hall was transplanted to mark his grave, and it bloomed year-round regardless of season, a perpetual reminder of grace and redemption. The inscription on his simple headstone read, "Vlad Dracula, born 1431, died 1748. He was lost to darkness but found his way back to light through the courage of those who believed redemption was possible." Elara lived another decade after Vlad's death, continuing the work they had begun together. She welcomed pilgrims to the castle, shared their story with any who would listen, and served as a living testament to the power of compassion and the reality of redemption. When her own time came, she faced it with the same courage she had shown in breaking the curse, unafraid and certain that she would be reunited with those she loved. On the morning of her death, surrounded by the priests and villagers who had become her family, Elara spoke her final words. "Tell the story. Tell everyone that no darkness is too deep to be overcome, that no sin is too great to be forgiven, that love and faith together can break any curse and redeem any soul. Let our journey be a sign of hope for all who struggle against their own darkness." She closed her eyes then, a peaceful smile on her aged face, and slipped quietly away. And in the moment of her passing, every rose in the castle bloomed simultaneously, filling the air with such fragrance that people in the valley below looked up in wonder, sensing that something extraordinary had occurred. They buried Elara beside Vlad, their graves marked by twin rose bushes that intertwined over the years, until it became impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. The castle continued to serve as a place of healing and hope, its dark history transformed into a story of redemption that inspired generations. And on certain nights, when the moon was full and the mountain air was clear, people claimed they could see two figures walking the battlements of Castle Dracula. A man and a woman, neither young nor old, neither fully present nor entirely absent. Their hands joined as they looked out over the land they had helped heal. Some said it was merely shadows and wishful thinking, but those who had known them, who had witnessed their journey from curse to redemption, knew better. They were Vlad and Elara, their souls freed at last from all burdens. continuing even in death the work of bringing light to places of darkness. They were proof that redemption was real, that love could conquer hatred, that compassion could break even the most terrible curses. They were a sign of hope for all who struggled and suffered, a reminder that no night was so dark that dawn could not follow. And in the garden where they lay buried, the roses bloomed eternal, white and pure, whispering their names to the wind and keeping alive the memory of the day when a peasant girl broke the curse that bound a vampire lord's soul, and he awoke redeemed, whispering the name of his savior with his first breath of true freedom. Elara. The name echoed through the mountains, carried on every breeze a benediction and a promise that love, faith and courage would always triumph over darkness in the end.